Well, good afternoon and welcome to the 2023 Schuylkill Watershed Congress. My name is Tim Fenchel and I'm on the staff of the Schuylkill River Greenways National Heritage Area. I'm also your moderator for the session today, which is Vacant Land in Philadelphia and Urban Gardens. And I'm pleased to welcome Sari Bernstein, who is with the Public Interest Law Center. And Sari, we're excited to have you with us, and you're welcome to present at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. As Tim said, my name is Sari Bernstein. I am a staff attorney at the Public Interest Law Center, where I focus on environmental justice and housing litigation. So today I'm going to talk to you about urban gardens. Gardens in Philadelphia, and I have a PowerPoint I can run through. As Tim mentioned, I'm going to do my best to sort of monitor the chat and the Q&A as I go. If I miss something, forgive me, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time at the end to catch any questions that I missed. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get going. So before I get going on the content, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Law Center. Public Interest Law Center uses 4 different tools. We use high impact litigation, we use education, we use advocacy, and we use organizing to advance the civil, social, and economic rights of communities in Philadelphia facing discrimination, inequality, and poverty. In our environmental justice practice, we really use all 4 of these strategies, and in particular in our Garden Justice Legal Initiative, obviously there's a big public education component, which is what I'm here doing today. This is actually adapted from a presentation called Vacant Land 215 being the zip code, the area code of Philadelphia, and we give the presentation about 4 times a year to gardeners. So if this is something that you think you know people who would be really interested in this presentation, for sure check our Twitter, our everything, our Instagram, our website, and we have 4 Vacant Land 215s that we'll be doing over the course of the next couple of months. So the Law Center, I don't know if you all are aware, has been around in Philadelphia for a long time. We were founded in 1969 as an affiliate to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and that was after President Kennedy called for lawyers to get involved in the civil rights movement. So there's an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and we are the organization based here in Philadelphia, and we have affiliates all over the country. As I mentioned, we have an environmental justice practice area, but we have 6 practice areas total. Those are on your screen: healthcare, public education, housing, which is the other area that I work in the most, employment, and voting. So the Garden Justice Legal Initiative is within our environmental justice practice, and it really grew out of a pretty dire need in Philadelphia to try to preserve the urban gardens that make up really important fabric of the neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So within Philly, there are actually 400 city gardens on average, which is a pretty high number. Most growers, though, are not land secure. So what that means in sort of common language is that folks are taking care of vacant land, having them be community gardens, production for food in the neighborhood, but they don't actually own that land. Much of that land is either been left by folks who've abandoned the property, but who are technically still the owners, or some of it might be actually publicly owned. And so we're going to talk about both of those situations today and what that means for people who are growing on land that's not secure. Another piece of the puzzle with urban gardens, which will come as no surprise to any of you, is gentrification and development pressure. There's always a push and pull, especially in a city that really does have an affordable housing crisis right now. And then the last piece is political pressure. We'll talk about this, but for folks to get access to publicly owned land in Philadelphia, you must have the support of your local city council person. You cannot get around that. So the political pressure piece is a big one. And the council person has a lot of say about what they think is the best use of vacant land in their community. When I, by the way, use the term vacant land, I'm not necessarily talking about a property that literally has nothing on it. It might have a garden on it. I just mean a property that does not have a building on it. The benefits of community gardens, I think, are pretty obvious to just about anyone who's ever walked by one, driven by one, or spent time in one. There's the obvious public health benefits. Just having a green space to be in is really, really important. There are a lot of studies about reductions in chronic health conditions, but also, and crucially in Philadelphia, reductions in violent crime, including gun violence in communities that have community gardens. And then there are the environmental benefits. So some studies have shown that having community gardens can decrease stormwater runoff in those communities by up to 85%. And there's also a really big effect on the heat island effect. So for those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia, there are communities that are way hotter than other neighborhoods, depending on the location in Philadelphia and how many trees are in that community. So by having a community garden, you actually can bring down the temperature of that immediate surrounding neighborhood with the trees. Also depending on the neighborhood, structures like buildings and roads and other infrastructure can absorb and remit the sun's heat more. And so the natural landscape, with trees and with grass can cut down on that. This is, I think, a really stark statistic that 1 in 4 Philadelphians are food insecure. That means that you are very likely to know at least one, if not more, people who are facing food insecurity in their lives. And what this means is that they lack kind of regular, reliable access to daily meals, and in particular, access to fresh foods. Some of you might be sort of familiar with a term called food deserts, which is essentially locations where there might not be grocery stores or grocery stores that have a lot of fresh food in them. So before I get into sort of the meat of today's presentation, I do have to give you the legal disclaimer, which is that I can only sort of give you the 20,000-foot view of the laws today, and they are complex, and frankly, they are changing. And because of this, the legal application is really case by case. So it's important that if you want legal advice, that you contact an attorney. And if you have legal questions about a particular situation, you work with that attorney on that particular situation. All right, without further ado. So today we're going to talk about sort of the 2 main tools to approach threatened gardens in Philadelphia. One is a legal strategy, and the example that I have here, which is really sort of the most important one, is called adverse possession. And then the other way is really an advocacy strategy, and I'll talk about that second. And that has to do with both your local city council person and the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation. So the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation, or PHDC, is the umbrella. It's not exactly a city agency, sort of a quasi-city agency that has within it the Philadelphia Land Bank, which I'll be talking more about, the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority, the Philadelphia Department of Public Property as well. So I'll be referring to PHDC and city council members, but the key point here is that it's really, really important to be as proactive as possible. So when you're starting out, if you are a gardener, let's say that you're helping out, on an established garden, or perhaps you've moved to a new neighborhood and you see that there is a vacant property that is collecting trash or otherwise is unsightly, or the neighborhood is in need of food, and you want to think about securing access to that land to have a garden that's secure. You want to start by asking yourself a couple of critical questions. The first is, how long has the potential client, or you in this case, been gardening on the vacant land? So has it been more or less than 21 years? In the first scenario I gave, where you're kind of joining in on an established garden, they may have been there for more than 21 years. And the second scenario I gave, where you just moved to the neighborhood, obviously you've not been there for 21 years. We'll talk about why that's important, but it goes to this issue of adverse possession, which is a legal strategy. The second is who owns the land. So if you don't own the land, right, but you want to get access to that land, you need to know who owns it. And there's two basically possibilities for the owner. They could be privately owned and very most likely tax delinquent, though sometimes it's privately owned and not tax delinquent. The reason I say it's likely tax delinquent is that if a property has literally been abandoned, I mean, the property has value, it's very likely that the person or people who own the property are not actually paying the taxes on the property, but that's not always the case. It could have been recently purchased and all the taxes are up to date. It's just that nothing has happened with the property. So it could be privately owned, or the property of the could be publicly owned. And so that would be owned by one of the city agencies I just mentioned that are under PHTC. And it's really easy in Philadelphia to find out who owns property. The website is right here on the page. And I'm sure we'll be sharing out these slides after, but you can just go to the property.phila.gov website, type in an address, and it'll immediately tell you who owns the property. I will give a caveat that the city's website tends not to be updated immediately. The actual immediate day-to-day is on the records department website, which you can get access to usually pretty easily for free, but just a slight caveat that, let's say someone tells you, that a property has been sold recently and you wanted to check it out, or it was sold last week, and you go to the website and it looks like it's still the same old owner. It's possible that the sale actually went through. It's just not online yet. So why does it matter who owns the land? It matters especially for privately owned land, because if you want to try to gain title to the land for a garden, you have to think about back taxes, which you'd be liable for, whatever is outstanding, any liens on the property, future taxes, depending on, again, how you gain access to that property, there might be future taxes, and then also stormwater fees, which we can talk a little bit more about at the end if you're interested, but these are, stormwater fees don't actually get issued based on whether or not there is literally water access on the property. There are fees that are pretty low that occur whether or not there's water access. And what happens with stormwater fees is that if they haven't been paid, then there are a lot of penalties and fees that sort of add up to make that a pretty big number. But if you're operating a garden going forward, there are possible programs available where you can get exemption for fees going forward. But these are the kinds of sort of upfront fees that you have to think about when you're thinking about taking over or trying to gain legal access to land. So the legal strategy that we talked about is adverse possession, and adverse possession is as old as it gets. It goes back to like years I think it's like about 1200 BC or so, this idea that one can gain access to land simply by being on it for a certain period of time. And in Pennsylvania, that period of time is 21 years, which is pretty long. One of the many advocacy projects that we have going on right now is to try to reduce the statutory time from 21 years down to 10 years, because 21 years is a very long time to have to try to meet all the elements of adverse possession that I'm going to tell you about in the next slide. But again, what this means in practical terms is that if you are gardening on a property that's not your own, and you have been doing this for 21 years and you meet all the other elements that I'll tell you about in a minute, if the owner does not come and try to eject you within 21 years from the initial date of the unauthorized use, then you actually may be able to take title or possession of the land through adverse possession. And so I've mentioned now a couple of times that there are elements. What are those elements? first is that it has to be hostile and adverse. This doesn't mean that you're having a fight with someone. It just means that you don't have permission to be there. The second is that it's actual, so you need to physically be on the land. The third is that it's exclusive and distinct. What this means is that it's just you or the garden, the nonprofit it's probably not a nonprofit, but it's just the gardeners that are on the land. It's not like sometimes you're there and then maybe you leave for a year and somebody else comes and takes care of the land. It has to be distinct to the person who's bringing the claim. The fourth is that it is visible, open, and notorious. What does this mean? This means that the owner should have every reason to know that you're there. So you're not like sneaking in the middle of the night, and leaving or something like that. I think with gardens, it's pretty easy that it's visible and open and notorious, but the person who owns the property has to actually know and be able to know that you have taken control of the property. And then finally, and this is a crucial one, it has to be continuous. So that means that you have been doing it for the entire 21 years. You haven't, lived in the neighborhood for 5 years and taken care of it and moved away for 5 years and come back and said, oh yeah, like I forgot about that garden. Let me see what's going on there, and sort of started that again. So that's all I have for the legal strategies piece of it. Again, obviously, each one of these elements comes with a lot of case law, and it's very, very fact specific, but sort of as a bird's eye view, that's what you have to start thinking about. So I'll pause here for a second and just see if anyone has questions about anything I've said so far. Oh, there's a raised hand from a participant. Okay, so this is the question. If you were to put a garden on, say, a country club and grow your garden on their land, would adverse possession eventually apply? So this is a good question. Heather is saying she's thinking of a golf course. I think it depends on many factors, of course, but essentially adverse possession in Pennsylvania is usually a legal remedy against a private owner. So why do I say private? I say that because in almost all circumstances, you cannot bring an adverse possession claim or have that as a defense against a public entity. So you'd have to look at who owns the golf course. But under almost all situations, you cannot bring an adverse possession claim against, for example, the city of Philadelphia or the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and some golf courses can potentially be publicly owned. So that's something to take a look at. But if you have something specific in mind, I would recommend talking to me or talking to someone else about like really what's going on for that particular situation. The other thing is, I'm saying in almost every situation, you can't bring a case against a publicly owned property. And that's because there is one very, very, very discrete outlier in Pennsylvania that I'm not going to get into too much right here because it almost always doesn't apply. But there is one very discrete situation when potentially someone can think about an adverse possession claim against public property, but it has to do with eminent domain and almost always doesn't apply. So hopefully that answers your question, or at least enough for now. Okay, great, thank you. All right, so for advocacy strategies, there's two kinds of advocacy strategies depending on whether the land is privately owned or it is publicly owned. And when I say privately owned in this situation, it would also have to be tax delinquent. And so this slide here is showing you what is the city's process for property disposition. This slide comes from the land bank, and sort of the reason of the land bank, which was established in 2013, which I have a slide about later, but it's useful to talk a little bit about now too, is to return land to productive use. So the existing situation right now for a vacant property is that it might be tax delinquent, and then there's a foreclosure and it goes to a sheriff's sale, and someone else buys the property, and potentially the property is developed on, or potentially it's not. And so the land bank was established as a way for the city to actually come in with the first right of a bid at an auction to clear title and then return the land to use through either residential, for example, for affordable housing, but one of the possible uses is for gardens. Now, since the pandemic has started, the city has not essentially been going forward with their acquisition policy, which is what I'm talking about right now. That has been pretty much on pause. So as far as I'm aware, no new land has gone into the land bank, but the way it's supposed to work is that the city has an opportunity for a piece of land that's been abandoned, that is tax delinquent, that is foreclosed on, to sort of have the first right to go in and bid for that property from share of sale to enter it into the land bank. So I've mentioned this a few times already. I'll say it again. You have to know your city council person, because if you wanted the land bank to try to gain access to a piece of land because you specifically wanted to apply, or your community garden, when I say you, I'm mostly going to be talking about nonprofits, but there is a side yard policy for individuals. But that if it's something that you wanted to be able to gain access to, you won't get access to it without your city council person's support. So getting a letter of support from your council person is one of the first steps to try to negotiate a land transfer with the city. You can find your council person if you don't know them by just going to the atlas.villa.gov website and typing in your address. And for those of you who do know your city council person, there are a few districts where lines are changing from January 2024. So just be aware of that and make sure that you, to the extent your city council person changes, because there's a lot of changes afoot in Philadelphia right now, you know who that person is. And, we've already talked about this a lot, that you're going to want to determine what kind of vacant land you are interested in obtaining. So let's talk about the first one. If the land is privately owned and tax delinquent. In those cases, it's possible under the city's acquisition policy to try to get title to that land. The land bank would use the share of sale process to acquire that. And, they could be either for a side or a rear yard. And those are for individuals who live next to the side of the rear yard, or it could be for a community use. And that would be for a community garden and open space. And there are certain criteria for the land bank to be able to acquire a policy. The land bank's acquisition and disposition policies are on their website. So they're not that long. You probably have a lot of questions when you read them, but it's worthwhile just to go and, take a look and get an idea of what it looks like. But some of the key elements is that the property has to be tax delinquent for over 3 years and have municipal liens of at least $2,000. Currently, as I mentioned, acquisitions are on hold. So hopefully they go back soon, but at the moment, they've been on hold. And then the other thing that's important, and we'll definitely discuss this on a further slide, is that the land bank essentially cannot acquire property with third-party liens. What do I mean by a third-party lien? What I mean by that is that it's a municipal lien that was sold to another entity at a point in time, and now that entity actually has that lien. So we'll talk about it a little bit going forward and how to figure out whether you're in that situation. But if the city goes forward and acquires the land, then it's part of the land bank's inventory. And so then what do they do? Then they would dispose of the property. So there's two different kinds of ways that they might dispose of property. One is a competitive sale. And so in this case, which is not usually a garden, right? This will be like a request for proposals for some sort of affordable housing development, or potentially for an individual property, but almost never. But then there are exceptions to competitive sales where you might be able to obtain land for a nominal fee, and side yards and rear yards and gardens and open space fall into those exceptions. So for a side or rear yard, this is a situation where you, let's say, own your home. Actually have to own your home to qualify, and you have a vacant property that's either right next to your house, so it's immediately adjacent to it, or it's immediately behind your house, your backyard, and that property is vacant and it's in the land bank and you're interested in acquiring it as a side or rear yard. There are a couple different qualifications, and if you go to the land bank's website, it'll kind of cue you through asking yourself the questions you need to ask to be able to gain access to that land. But one of the key pieces, right, is that you own and live adjacent to the property, and you cannot have city delinquencies. So meaning you have to be up to date on your taxes, on your water, for your house. You can't have any outstanding licenses and inspections violations. And then when you apply, you have to know that there's going to be a lot of restrictions on the use of the property. And this is true for side yards, and it'll be true for community gardens as well. And the uses are pretty intense. So their restrictions are for 30 years. There's a whole list of things that you cannot do on the land for 30 years, like parking or storage of other vehicles, has to be fenced. And then another key piece is that there's something called a 30-year self-amortizing mortgage that has to be considered. And so it would be satisfied at the end of the 30-year period if you've sort of done everything that you're supposed to do. But if not, then the agency, depending on the kind of mortgage that it is, potentially even gets to be repaid. And so there's been a lot of advocacy around this because it has a lot of implications for individuals and for community gardens. But it's something that you should know going in, that as of right now is the city's policy, because you're getting the land for not by nominal consideration. I literally mean $1. They want to make sure that it's being preserved for the actual garden use. And so this is the tool that they're using right now to be able to do that. And so if this is something that you're really thinking about, I highly recommend that you talk to a lawyer or get in touch with other advocates who are working on this issue to sort of better understand what that might mean for you. So if it's not a side yard or a rear yard, then it's a community garden. And again, this is a title transfer. So in order for it to be a title transfer for community gardens, the community garden has to be a nonprofit. Does not need to be a 501c3, but it does need to be a nonprofit organization. And there will be, as I just mentioned, this 30-year self-amortizing mortgage as the policies are now, which is something we're doing a lot of advocacy about. There's also deed restrictions that get written into the deed and recorded. If that's not something that you're interested in, so let's say that you're a community garden and it's, you don't want to take on the actual title, but you want to have the legal right to be gardening on that land. Another option is a lease. The city right now, as of the last time I checked, actually did not have a lease up on their website, but hopefully we'll have one up soon. They can be for anything from a month to month, sort of like a license agreement, or they can go up to I believe 5 years, though I've never seen one myself. And so those would be for community gardens or open managed space, and you don't have a residency requirement. You don't need to live right next to it, but you're still going to have use restrictions. So it still has to be as the garden. And then crucially, there's also an insurance requirement. So it's something to keep in mind for actually all the kinds of dispositions. There is an insurance requirement that you hold the insurance. And then finally, the city also occasionally enters into sort of individual garden agreements. So those are lease agreements, but they're lease agreements with individuals or households instead of with nonprofits. And you can use the garden in those situations for your personal use, but you have to live within a certain distance of the property. Okay, so this goes back to something that I mentioned earlier about third-party liens. In 1997, the city of Philadelphia bundled together all of its municipal liens on vacant properties and sold those to what is now US Bank. It was a different bank at the time, in exchange for a loan to fund the Philadelphia School Department. The city then defaulted on that loan. And so what it meant is that the bank could go ahead and collect on the liens by bringing the individual parcels to sheriff's sale. And The effect of this is that gardeners who are gardening on vacant land that they don't have legal title to, that's privately owned and that has this tax balance, that land could be subject to a sheriff sale. Sheriff sales were paused during the pandemic, but have been going on now for let's see, like well over a year. You know, there's also a bunch of negotiation going on to see if there's anything that can be done to try to stop the sheriff sales for the third party liens, but the city has taken the position that they cannot acquire those to enter into the land bank to date. So, you know, we keep a really close eye on this. If you want to find out if a property has a US bank lien, you can search the parcel address on the real estate tax balance search. The website is there. And then when you look at the tax balance and the balance details, if the balance begins in 1997, which is when the liens were sold, and the liens are held by Linebarger, which is a law firm that is like a collections firm, it's a good indication that the property has a US bank lien. But the website does not tell you how much that lien is. The website is telling you what the city amount is. So to figure out what the US bank lien amount is, you have to call this telephone number here and they can let you know. The sheriff sales are on a website called bidforassets.com. I can type it into the chat. And you can see it's run by the sheriff, by the sheriff's office. And you can go there and go to Philadelphia's tax foreclosure page, and you'll see upcoming sales on that website. So if you're interested in a specific property and want to know what's going on, you can also check there, but you should check back frequently. This slide here was given to us by Neighborhood Gardens Trust, which is a great organization in Philadelphia that acts as a trust for neighborhood gardens. There's one other thing I should add, which is that if you are interested in trying to acquire a parcel that has US bank liens on them, again, you'll want to talk to a lawyer because there's potential defenses that can come into place depending on how old the liens are. But those are very much on a case-by-case basis. So finally, this is our website, groundedinphilly.org, that goes through a lot of the information that I just gave you. And so the website is sort of a living document. We do our best to keep it updated, but honestly, things are changing all the time. You know, if you see something on the website that looks wrong to you, we encourage you, and there's contact information there to get in touch with us and let us know. But tens of thousands of people go to Grounded in Philly every year in Philadelphia, and it's a really great resource that's pretty user friendly. So like if you are you know, in one of these various situations that I've just talked to you about today, and you know, it'll kind of guide you through the step-by-step of how you might want to think about it. And then here is our contact information, and you know, we encourage you to get in touch with us. I'm always happy to talk to folks, and I know our environmental justice organizer who's focused on gardens, Ryan, is also here with us today, and Ryan's also, you know, happy to talk to gardeners and has been talking to gardeners for a long time in Philadelphia. So that is it for the formal presentation. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to take off the share so we can see, or I guess we can't all see each other, but I have plenty of time for questions if folks have other things that they wanted to talk about now.
Yes, we'll take another minute or so here. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and Sari can answer them before we end this presentation. We'll give it another minute for you to enter any questions.
One quick question. Where would people, you referred to the number of times that this presentation can be offered again. Where would people find that information on the website that you referenced?
We don't have the dates yet, but when we do, this is our website. And so we usually post the dates there, but we also, if you have like Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, we always put that stuff up on, like, that social media is sort of the best place to get it. So just follow us and you can get the information there. We sort of blast it out. So dates coming soon.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting. Really appreciate you presenting for the Congress. And thanks again, Sari, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.